Sony's output for this thing was actually pretty good at first until it wasn't. So this was a situation where the sales just weren't meeting their expectations at first, so they kind of just dropped off support. But towards the latter half of their support, I mean, we still got a lot of great collections out of it on the system, obviously, as I discussed before, with some of the PS2 collections, as well as the straight up PS3 to PS Vita. Like, there were some games that were cross-buy on PS Vita and then PS3 and PS4 as well, like Entwined, which... Oh, Entwined is such an amazing game. If you haven't played it, you have to play it. It's only like maybe an hour and a half long at absolute tops. It is such a beautiful game. It is about a bird and a fish that are in love, but it's just, I don't want to spoil it. Please play it, or at least watch a playthrough of it. It is truly magical and had me in tears by the end, because it is just... It's one of those games where it's truly a work of art. Like, it's so beautiful. It's a masterpiece. But that was one of those examples of a game that was cross-buy between, like, PS3, PS Vita, and PS4. And for the most part, a lot of Sony's IPs, even IPs that they tend to neglect nowadays, were well represented on the Vita. It's just a shame because, again, as I had mentioned, partway through the console's life cycle, it was clear to Sony that the sales weren't exactly meeting their expectations, so they just kind of dropped off of support, and from there, it just kind of kept... It was the domino effect, you know. Sony stopped supporting it, eventually the third parties kind of stopped supporting it, but there was still support for a while there, and then by the time the system came to its end, it was just down to the indies to keep it alive, which, hey, you know, the PS Vita still got a lot of the very late indies, you know, like Retro City Rampage and Shakedown Hawaii and stuff like that, you know, those very late games, like those certain developers where they were like, hey, we're gonna be the ones to put the last game out for this system. So, you know, in some cases, those were like the last games to go out on certain systems. So the indies kept this thing alive. And beyond all the indies, there were so many amazing third-party games on this console. In fact, I have a 512 gigabyte SD card in my PS Vita. So what we're gonna do together, just so we can like make sure that no stone is left unturned, we're gonna turn this thing on. And while I'm not gonna run through my entire game collection, we are gonna talk about a decent majority of the games that I feel like are worth mentioning just to prove how much of a powerhouse the PS Vita was. So just starting at the top, I have all of my things labeled in like folders here. So we'll go into the A folder first things first. Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, essentially Assassin's Creed 3, but again, built with handhelds in mind. So unlike in a normal Assassin's Creed game where it's just constantly climbing towers, constantly having to sync with the environment, you know, building up the map and stuff like that. It's a more stripped down experience, but it's still, you know, very streamlined, very fun. It's not stripped back in a bad way. It's just stripped back for handhelds. So that game, absolute powerhouse. And you had games like Army Corps of Hell, which was super just innovative, yeah, a quirky game where it was like sort of like Pikmin, but in hell fighting demons. It was such a cool game. Then you had a lot of really fun mobile ports on here, like Angry Birds Trilogy, Angry Birds Star Wars, Age of Zombies, such an underrated twin stick shooter that I've recommended and talked about in previous videos. And again, going back to what we were talking about the indie support on this thing, you know, like Axiom Verge is sitting here in my A folder, AC Chronicles, which obviously isn't an indie game, but you know, it's like a cool 2D, like almost indie-esque type of Assassin's Creed game there. Always thought those games were really cool. You got games like As Divine Hearts, and then games like A Boy and His Blob, Adventures of Mana, the Atari Flashback Classics, which you know, like every console under the sun has their Atari collection, but the PlayStation Vita had a good amount of those like arcade type collections on there, which I always thought was really cool. Batman Arkham Origins Blackgate, a real cool spin-off of the Batman Arkham Origins, or the Batman Arkham games, and I would highly recommend checking it out. It's more of like a 2.5D type game, but you know, it's definitely worth playing if you're into the Batman Arkham games. It's really cool how they were able to take that classic 3D, you know, like the free-flowing combat type of thing, and convert it into a completely different gameplay style, and yet still have it feel like it belongs within the same storyline, continuity, and universe, and still fit the theme of like, or fit the tone, I guess, rather, of the Batman Arkham games. Like, it is really good, and it's not that long either. You could definitely beat it within a day or two. Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon, Borderlands 2, which we had already talked about, Black Ops Classified, Dead Nation, which was also another cross-buy game, Disney Epic Mickey 2, some of the Disgaea games, Dead or Alive 5, the Danganronpa games, Don't Starve. You had a bunch of Dynasty Warriors, Dragon Quest Builders, which if you haven't played Dragon Quest Builders before, it's basically like Dragon Quest meets Minecraft, and it's an absolute blast. A lot of charm there. Love that game so much. Entwined, as I was talking about, Earth Defense Force. You had Final Fantasy X and X-2 on here, which was absolutely mind-blowing at the time to see those games running and so flawlessly on a handheld machine. Fruit Ninja, because you can't go wrong with Fruit Ninja. Freedom Wars, which was like an insane twist on Monster Hunter. Please play Freedom Wars if you never played it before. Again, with the amazing indies like Fez, and then Gravity Rush. Gravity Rush is such a good game, and I'm so glad that not only did they remaster it on PS4, but that the game also got a sequel, because that's one of the things about the PlayStation Vita era, and even some of the eras before that, where if you had a game that wasn't necessarily selling big numbers like, say, God of War, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that it was going to be shown any sort of acknowledgement really moving forward, whether it be through remasters or new games. But I'm glad Gravity Rush got the support, despite the fact that it started life on the PlayStation Vita. And it's unfortunate because even for some games that were selling like hotcakes, like Killzone and Resistance and such, because those games were huge at the time, Sony just kind of dropped support on them after a while, and that's really sad. And then you have some of the collections we were talking about, like God of War and all that. You got the God Eater games, which are really cool. Hotline Miami, the first Helldivers. Then you got ports of some amazing fighting games on here, like Injustice, Gods Among Us, Mortal Kombat 9, which... again, that's another situation where, especially for a game like Injustice, you know, in 2013, also releasing on the PlayStation Vita, just mind-blowing. Seeing games that are running at, like, full HD on the home consoles at the time, like the Wii U, 360, and PS3, also running on a handheld like this, like, just incredible. Jet Set Radio, the Jak and Daxter collection, a whole ton of LEGO games, and if you guys know me, I love my LEGO games. Little Deviants, Little Big Planet, PlayStation Vita, which is hands down one of my favorite Little Big Planet games. The way that they utilize the hardware of the PlayStation Vita to where it didn't even feel like a gimmick. When you were using the touchscreen and the touchpad to interact with different parts of the environment, none of it ever felt like a gimmick. It felt like it belonged in the game, which is amazing because obviously when you have a handheld like this with so many, I guess you could say niche or quote-unquote gimmicky features, it's real easy for them to start to feel kind of gimmicky, right? Like, you know, when you're waggling the Wiimote back and forth, like that can start to feel gimmicky in certain games where it's like, all right, why do I need to waggle this every time just to have Donkey Kong pound the ground? You know what I mean? But in Little Big Planet, like that was a game where I was like, okay, this actually belongs and adds to the experience, and that's how you know that a quote-unquote gimmick is good. And that's how I feel about like the PS4 and PS5, for example. Like a lot of times where games on there will utilize gyro or the HD rumble, or, you know, I look at like Astro's Playroom with all the ways that utilize the remote, whether you're moving it or, you know, playing with the touchpad or kind of like moving the controller around to feel how many Astros are rolling around in there. Like that's using a quote-unquote, what could be a quote-unquote gimmicky feature and turning it into something that doesn't feel gimmicky and is instead enhancing the experience, which is amazing. And then just to go on talking about how many amazing IPs were represented here on the PlayStation Vita: MotorStorm, Mod Nation Racers, Monkey Ball, Muramasa Rebirth. Then you had Minecraft PlayStation Vita Edition, which is essentially just like the 360 or PS3 version, just on the PS Vita. Then you had more amazing console ports like Need for Speed Most Wanted, some of the Ninja Gaiden games. And if you know anything about the alphabet, you know we're getting close to the P's, which means we're going to be talking about one of the big ones here in a moment. But then you got other games like the Odd World was very well represented here on the PlayStation Vita. Some of the Ollie Ollie games. Odin Sphere, I'm not exactly sure how to say it correctly. Lifthrazir, whatever. You know, I've been playing that game since the PS2 days, and yet I still can't properly pronounce it, despite the fact that I've beaten that game like a handful of times at this point. I'll learn how to say it one day. And then you had a port of Plants vs. Zombies, just because Plants vs. Zombies was on everything at the time. PlayStation All-Stars, which for those that don't know, that was essentially like PlayStation's take on like Super Smash Bros. And the fact that they only did one game on that and never even decided to re-release it, it's just despicable. If they would bring that back nowadays, could you imagine? What if they did it with like that? Like, would they do it in a cartoon art style, or would they do it hyper realistic like most of their first party games? If so, that means we could technically see Spider-Man fighting Ellie along with Kratos, and maybe even Ratchet and Clank. And then not only do you have Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5 all technically represented here with the Persona 3, 4, and 5 dancing games, but then you also have Persona 4 Golden. Oh my gosh, just saying that name. Oh gosh, the memories, nostalgia, everything's flowing through. Got the soundtracks playing in my head, it's going. All right. Oh man, something's telling me I'm gonna need to start up another PlayStation Vita Persona 4 Golden playthrough here soon. But Persona 4 Golden, what do I even say about this game that hasn't already been said before? It is an absolutely amazing, like, it's one of those games where if you haven't played it, I'm scared to say anything because I don't want to spoil it for you. So the only way that I can really say anything about this game is to keep it as bare as possible, because I really feel like with this game especially, just because not only with how long it is, but also just how much there is to chew on, like right out the gate. Okay, I'm just gonna say this. If you want characters to fall in love with, I mean, really, you could go with any Persona game and you do just fine, but Persona 4 is definitely like, it's one of those games where by the time the credits roll, you're going to be crying because you don't want to say goodbye to your best friends and, you know, everybody you've come to know and love. The soundtrack in this game, it's as amazing as it is in any other Persona game. It's one of those ones where when somebody passes you the aux in the car, you're gonna turn on the Persona 4 Golden OST, whether you realize it or not. And above all else, if you want just some classic turn-based RPG fun, Persona 4 Golden, baby. It is worth noting that, as with most Persona games, it can suck up a lot of time, anywhere from the high end of the double-digit numbers to, in my case, the triple or quad-digit numbers. Not in one playthrough. It's just that, you know, I mean, for one playthrough, yes, it will take you dozens of hours, but, you know, the only reason that I'm near the quad hours, if not already past it, is because, well, I've played it a lot. Just some other games we can point out here: Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault, the Ratchet & Clank Collection, Ridge Racer! You guys remember that one? That is like an iconic showcase in PlayStation history, man, let me tell you, for the PSP. Run Sackboy Run, which was also on the PS3. That was a fun little experiment. Resogun, I forget if I already said that. That game, yeah, like, that's one of those Housemarque games, and Housemarque has always been one of my favorite Sony PlayStation developers. Their games are so creative. You have games like that, and like Matterfall, for example. Like, you know, their games, it's one of those things where they seem to be relatively niche or just kind of unknown in the grand scheme of things, and it's really a shame because they really do just harken back to those classic, like, arcadey days of video games. But I absolutely love it because it's just, it's one of those things where, like, yes, it's like drop in and drop out kind of fun, but at the same time, it's, you know, their games always require a certain level of skill. It's, how's that saying go? Easy to learn, hard to master. Then you had more awesome ports like Rayman Origins or Rayman Legends, which were, again, like console Rayman games, or Resistance Burning Skies, or they were Revelations 2. More amazing RPGs with, like, Revenant Saga and Romancing Saga and stuff like that. Now we're down in the S's. All the Sly Cooper games, literally all of them were represented here. You had a cool spin-off of Silent Hill with Silent Hill Book of Memories, which was essentially like a Diablo version of Silent Hill, which I always thought was really cool. Street Fighter X Tekken, the SteamWorld Dig, SteamWorld Heist, a bunch of Sword Art Online, a bunch of Samurai Warriors, which is essentially a spin-off of like the Dynasty Warriors games, Super Meat Boy, Stardust, the Walking Dead Telltale games, as well as the Wolf Among Us Telltale game, the Amazing Spider-Man, which we already talked about, Tearaway, which was also another amazing PlayStation Vita exclusive platformer for a time. It's kind of a platformer, more or less like a puzzle platformer, I guess, but thankfully that one was also ported to the PlayStation 4 with Tearaway Unfolded. So if you want to play that game nowadays but don't have a PS Vita, that would be a great way to do it. I do believe it's available on the PS Plus Extra and Premium service. Touch My Katamari, Terraria, Suikoden, the Binding of Isaac Rebirth, obviously, just legendary game right there. Tales of Hearts R, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom, Undertale, Uncharted Golden Abyss, Unit 13, which is a really underrated one. I might have forgotten to mention Breach and Clear earlier, which I have on here. That game's awesome. Valkyria Revolution, the Wipeout 2048, which if you haven't played a Wipeout game before, that's another series that's pretty underrated in the grand scheme of things nowadays. More people talked about it back then, but not as much nowadays. World of Final Fantasy, you got some Worms games on here, XCOM, Enemy Unknown, Xenocrisis, some of the Ys games, which if you've never played Ys, that's another one where it's like, oh man, you gotta check those out, and there's gonna be a perfect time to do it because Ys 10 is gonna be coming out here soon, finally in the States. It already released in Japan, but it'll be making its way stateside, so yeah, Ys 10 Nordics. But for anybody curious, the ones on the PS Vita are Ys 8, Ys Memory of Salsetta, and Ys Origin. And then another one that I wanted to highlight real quick is, well, not only the Zero Escape games, which I also just saw in my Z folder there, those games are really fun as well, but because I have it in my hashtag folder, which just means that it starts with like a non-character, is Root Letter. It's an amazing visual novel. It's not too long either. You could easily beat it over the course of a weekend, but amazing story, amazing mystery. It's one of those games where you're going to start it and you're not going to want to put it down until you see how everything plays out and how it ends. It's such an amazing visual novel. Definitely give Root Letter a chance, or at least watch a playthrough of it if you haven't before, because that one is so overlooked and so underrated. It is a fantastic game, but I could go on and on. That is literally just scratching the surface of the games that I have on my PlayStation Vita, because, you know, if I would have ran through every single game, it would have taken double the length, but I really just wanted to emphasize, like, how many amazing experiences just from those few dozen that I listed off are to be had on the PlayStation Vita, and it's part of why I miss the system so much, because you, again, had so many amazing experiences that were ported directly from consoles, but then you also had so many that were just exclusive to the PS Vita, whether it be at the time or to this day, or ended up being ported to other consoles down the line just because of how amazing the games that themselves were. And that's not even to mention the fact that the PS Vita is basically multiple consoles in one, because you have access to the entire PlayStation Portable library on here, as well as the PlayStation 1. And if you want to start modding and emulating things, dude, you can easily emulate SNES, NES, Neo Geo, TurboGrafx, PS1, well, PS1 isn't even emulation, well, it's technically emulation, but, you know, you can already run that on there natively, but you know what I mean, like, any of those, like, 32 and 16-bit systems for the most part, I'm sure this thing could probably run N64, I might be wrong about that, but I don't see why it couldn't. There's literally, like, GTA 3 PlayStation Vita ports running at the moment. They're not official by any means, but they're still making it run on the system, so I'm sure you could do, like, any of those systems, but seriously, there's so much emulation potential there if you want to get into that, on top of the systems that I already mentioned with the PSP and PS1 that it already officially supports, as well as all the cross-buy PS3, PS4, and PS Vita games, and thankfully to this day, the store is still up and active on the PlayStation Vita, so if you pick one up today, you can still buy all those games legitimately, and if you want to go out and buy the PlayStation Vita cartridges, I'm not gonna lie, it's a little expensive to collect for the system, so you might want to be selective there, or at least make sure you have a good bit saved up. The PlayStation Vita itself is not relatively expensive in the grand scheme of, I don't want to say retro hardware, because the Vita is definitely not retro, but it's definitely getting a bit up there in age. It is 12 years old at this point. Yeah, it's definitely not expensive as it could be, you know, only a little over $100 maybe, but it's definitely worth the cost investment between the quality of the hardware that you're getting, on top of the games